Yesterday was the United Nations World Day of Peace, and there was a small ceremony in Queen's Park at midday with prayer and an evening's discussion on peace and climate change, because they are both very closely linked. Peace was the main reason for the United Nations being set up 74 years ago, for the world had just finished a devastating and crippling war where really no one was the real winner. Too much and too many lost on all sides. Since then, the United Nations has had a fair mix of success and failures. And it is, of course, very hard to keep the peace with powerful 2-year-olds strutting about their playpens and throwing their toys at each other. But we have avoided another world war and the use of atomic weapons. Just, but it's happened. And United Nations diplomats have made a very major contribution to that. But war and the preparations for it continue to cripple our planet, not only through the actual devastation of a bombed city, but through the massive commitment of resources that go towards it. I read the other day that 3% of this year's United States military expenditure could eliminate starvation from the whole world. And even little New Zealand, with no enemies, is spending $90 million a week on our armed forces. And it went up 20% in this year's welfare budget. And surprisingly, very few people questioned that. But it is, of course, money taken away from health, education, and housing and climate change. Well, there's nothing new about this. Jesus had the same problems. His people were very highly taxed, which is why there's so much about tax collectors in the Gospels. And some of that tax, of course, went to Caesar and Herod to keep them in socks. But much of the rest went to their armies to make sure that the colonials were kept docile for the Romans. And the Roman peace, of course, was maintained by a very ruthless army. And there was always pressure on Jesus to be a violent revolutionary and free Israel from the yoke of Rome. It was a messianic expectation, and all the other false messiahs, about 12 known within 100 years of Jesus, had all started a revolution, a violent revolution. So it was a messianic expectation, and a reason why many felt that Jesus couldn't be the Messiah, as he didn't take up arms. The nearest he got to it was to have a zealot among his disciples, but a disarmed zealot. So Jesus turned his back on violence and refused to be the military King David type of leader many of his people wanted. He didn't neglect the topic, however, but provided a new way of dealing with conflict and injustice that could be used in many contexts. Could be used from domestic violence, which we have far too much, to the international relations. And much of his new way is summarized in those few verses of today's reading, a mere handful of words, but words that are world-changing. Those words: love your enemies, don't hate them, don't use violence to resist evil, and then there are 3 little case studies: turn the other cheek, give away your cloak, walk the 2nd mile. Violence is the default position of so much in this world, and it is daringly turned on its head by Jesus. Non-violence is the default position in the kingdom of God. So when we look at our gospel passage, I think first we need to clear up a little bit of a nonsense in verse 39, where most translations, and I was interested to see what was read today, say, "Do not resist evil." Well, that's a total nonsense, isn't it? We're not to go along with evil. In fact, we're to overcome evil with good. And it puzzled me for a long time why it was translated that way. And then I read Tom Wright's translation of that verse, which is, "Don't use violence to resist evil." His explanation for his translation is that the Greek word for resist originally meant resist as an army would resist, which is by fighting. So Jesus' message is, don't resist an evil as an army would do it, by fighting and killing, but resist evil in a non-military way. Resist it in a non-violent way, as civilians. So still resist, but not by killing people. And then, straight after that, he gives us 3 little stories that explains what he means. We are to do things like turn the other cheek, give away your shirt, walk the 2nd mile. Well, there's only time to look at 2 of those stories. But interestingly, both of them have got into our everyday language. So quite a few people are quoting scripture, even though they've never opened a Bible in their lives. Well, that's quite encouraging, really. But the trouble is that the original meaning has been changed. In everyday language, turning the other cheek means be passive, don't fight back, do a puppy dog rollover, be a doormat, a pushover. It can also mean, oh, I'm such a worm, hit me again, I won't resist. But you see, we've got it wrong. Jesus didn't mean that. And the clue to his meaning is that he specifies the right cheek. Verse 39, if anyone hits you on the right cheek, turn the other. We don't offer the right cheek again for another slap. It must be the left one that we offer. And they were a right-handed society. They never used their left hand for quite a lot of things. The left hand was sort of the dirty hand. So the hitter is naturally hitting with the right hand. So let's just do a little bit of cheek hitting. Turn to your neighbor and face each other. And one of you must be the striker, and the other one must be the struck. So, striker. Strike using your right hand comfortably. Strike the right cheek of your neighbor. Now, just remember you're Anglicans and you're always nice to each other, and this is not a time to settle old scores. Now, how are you managing it to strike comfortably with your right hand, the right cheek? I see some people striking the left cheek with their right hand. That's quite wrong. You've all got it right? So you strike with your right on the right cheek. Now turn the struck one your left cheek. And striker, strike again. And do you notice the difference for the striker? I'm sure you do. In that honor society, striking the right cheek is a humiliation. But it doesn't damage the cheek very much, because it's just with the back of the hand, isn't it? Only the humanity and the confidence of the person struck is what is damaged, not the skin. And it's what the master or mistress of the house might do to their slave, or the farm manager to his day worker, or a man to his wife in a bad marriage. It was reinforcing the servant's lowly status. It was sign of contempt. It's actually gone through the centuries, hasn't it? The backhand slap, sign of contempt. It's not a way of knocking someone out. But hitting the left can be hard and painful because it is open-handed. And in that society, that was always a blow between equals, between people of equal status, two landowning farmers, for example. So if the aggressor does hit the left cheek of his slave, he's actually saying, we are social equals. So he is likely to turn down his slave's request. It's a dilemma for the one with all the power, and very cheeky on the part of the servant. So Jesus is saying, stick up for yourself. Don't be humiliated. Make your master or mistress think about their arrogance and your shared humanity. An invitation to strike the left cheek is saying that we're both made in the image of God. We are, which we are, of course. Whatever the inequality now, we are both God's children, both valuable. And a little thought later on, maybe we should do something about this injustice, where you are the powerful master and I am the powerless slave. So, turning the other cheek is not being a passive doormat for my boss to wipe his boots on, as is the meaning in our everyday language. On the contrary, it was a courageous challenge to the one with all the earthly power. The intended humiliation is positively challenged and the striker put on the back foot. So, turning the left cheek is a non-violent action, and it's very different from being passive or running away, and also different from an eye for an eye, which is what our reading started with, sort of eye for an eye punch-up. It is not fight or flee, but Jesus' other way of dealing with conflict and resisting an evil. And now let's look at the second mile, frequently used in our everyday language. Going the second mile, which means in that everyday language, doing more good than expected, persevering in your good deed, giving that little extra bit, which is all very virtuous and good. But that, unfortunately, is not what Jesus originally meant. He is, as usual, far more subversive. Roman soldiers carried about 50k of equipment, which is hard work. But they were the conquerors, so they could requisition any one of their subject people to carry their bags. And that, not surprisingly, is what they did. It didn't make them all that popular, as you can well imagine. However, the Roman High Command didn't want to get too unpopular. They had enough riots on their hands anyway. They wanted the locals to think how lucky they were to be conquered by us. So, as a public relations exercise, a soldier could only conscript a civilian for 1 mile. 1 mile. A soldier caught making someone go a second mile was severely punished, a good flogging at least. So here's a little Jesus story taken from the everyday life of quite a lot of his listeners, because many of his people would have experienced this. A soldier passes a day laborer working in his master's vineyard. The laborer is ordered to carry the soldier's equipment, never mind that the laborer loses part of his wages and the family goes hungry that night. He carries the loads until he reaches the milestone, 1 mile. "Put it down," says the soldier. But instead of putting it down, the carrier carries on. "Oh, no," he says, "I'd love to carry it further. It really is very heavy, and I realize your difficulty. As there is no one around, I will help you out for a 2nd mile. Delighted to help." And he begins to walk the 2nd mile cheerfully. The soldier, very aware that there may be someone who would sneak to his commander about this, soon stops ordering the load to be put down, and he begins to even ask, beg. He might even be prepared to pay to stop this helpful peasant going a second mile. The one who was powerless now has the upper hand on that second mile. It's quite a difference, isn't it? A social injustice is reversed, and I think that soldier's going to carry his own loads in the future, and hopefully he has realized that both of them are human. So easy to think that a conquered peasant is a lesser mortal to be casually exploited. So Jesus explains his response to the Roman occupation of his country, saying there are other ways to keep Israel viable, but still live with the Romans and still resist the Romans. Our Bible reading is a very significant part of his answer. The Israel of his time, as we know, took no notice. They in the end sought a violent solution, and they were destroyed. Modern Israel is equally violent. I just wonder whether they will suffer the same fate. So, if the violence of war is not the way of Jesus, then of course there's no need for all that costly preparation. Our $90 million a week can go on other things, like a civil defense force or housing. A non-violent response to a violent threat, of course, needs a lot of creativity and courage. For example, we're not finding it easy to stop family violence in this country, let alone international bullies. But it is possible, and it has been done. Interestingly, in Kolansky's History of Nonviolence, which he wrote just a few years ago, he says, "The early Christians are the earliest known group to renounce warfare in all its forms and reject all the institutions of war." So at that time, soldiers that converted to Christianity had to leave the army. In a list of people who could not be baptized until they left their occupation, there were brothel keepers and assassins, which doesn't surprise us, but soldiers are in the same list, which possibly surprises some people. For 300 years, the Church held all human life sacred and refused to kill anyone. But unfortunately, it all turned to custard with Constantine. However, there are still groups that remain in that tradition of non-violence. The groups like the Quakers and the Franciscans, the people like Martin Luther King in the States, Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, and our own Te Whiti at Parihaka. And in terms of big things, the Berlin Wall fell as a result of non-violent action. There are 2.5 billion Christians in the world. And if we all lived our reading as the early church did, it would be a very different place. There would still be some wars, but with all Christians other chicas and second milers, we would be very much nearer to Isaiah and Micah's vision of the world at peace, with swords beaten into plowshares, and the job of the United Nations would be so much easier.